Holy crap. We have got a lot of stuff to cover and very little time to waste. So let's start with iOS 14. I thought this was going to be a quiet year for iOS since iOS 13 was one of the most buggy releases Apple has had in recent memory, and we knew that the Mac was going to take a lot of the limelight. Well, I would be wrong, because iOS 14 might be the biggest visual update to iOS since iOS 7. So let's start with the home screen widgets. Finally. Remember that jailbreak tweak I showed you about a month ago? Well, you get nearly the same implementation here. Enter jiggle mode and then press the arrow in the top left-hand corner of the screen. And you get to choose from a list of first, and in the future, third-party widgets. You can choose the size of the widget, and it actually moves the icons in order to fit wherever you want the widget to go, which is kind of nice. Tapping on the widget not only opens the app, but will actually trigger the action you've selected, like, say, a news story. Each widget has its own settings panel, which is kind of cool, but oddly, to resize, you have to delete the widget and then re-add it, which seems kind of silly. The best widget, however, is a smart stack, which allows you to, well, stack your widgets instead of having them clutter up your whole home screen. Nice. Apple has also stolen a page from the Android playbook and given us exactly what I've been asking for since literally 2008 when Android launched. They gave us an app drawer. You can still have as many app screens as you want, but you can now have as few as you want too. Those excess apps that you don't want to organize and only use a few times per year, well, they now live in the new app library. Now, this seems a little bit buggy at the moment, but I would assume that it improves before final release. But all of your apps appear inside of this app library, even the ones on a traditional home screen page. Now, you can remove an app from the home screen page by tapping Add to Library, even though it's already there by default, and it will disappear from your classic home screen. Apps are automatically added into their App Store identified categories in a grid of 4. 3 hotkey apps, and then 1 full screen folder of all of the other automatically categorized apps. Now, in what I assume must be a bug, you can't seem to change the icons that are selected as the 3 hotkey apps. What I don't suspect as a bug, however, is that you can't actually specify that a specific app go into a specific folder, nor can you choose and create custom folders. Hopefully that's changed by final release, but what you can do, however, is tap the app library search bar, or pull down, to enter an alphabetical listing of all of your installed apps, similar to the Android app drawer. It is efficient, it is fast, and while I don't think it will replace lazy me searching for pretty much every app from my main home screen, it's a nice addition that I am sure many will love. Add it to the list of things that Android has done right from day one. Those are the 2 big headlining visual features, but there are several other nice things too. Incoming call notifications no longer take over your entire screen. Picture-in-picture, it now exists for FaceTime and other video applications on the iPhone, though we'll see if YouTube implements it. I'm betting not. iMessage has added the ability to pin important conversations to the top of your app, which is really handy for frequently used contacts. And there's now the ability to reply to an inline message, a la Slack, which can be particularly handy in group messages where one long thread of multiple conversations can get confusing fast. Oh, people can also mention your name inside of a group thread and you will be notified, even if the thread is muted, which can be handy for active threads that you don't necessarily keep up on all the time. Sorry, COD crew. Oddly enough, they talked about maps a lot. I don't really care about maps, but in short, if you do, they added EV charging routing, cycling directions, and guides for unknown cities, which could be handy. There's a new Translate app which doesn't require a network connection, but it supports dictation, which is pretty cool. I'm bilingual, and in my test from English to Spanish, it wasn't perfect, but it was pretty close to Google Translate in accuracy, and it was crazy fast. Nice when traveling abroad. Siri is now small. Well, smaller. And no, I'm not talking about the number of capabilities. Zinger. Now, visually, the assistant doesn't take up the whole screen anymore. And I think in a lot of circumstances, it looks really nice. But in certain apps with dark backgrounds, I still found it a bit hard to see. Additionally, while the whole screen isn't visually obstructed, it's still taken hostage and you can't actually interact with content while Siri is doing anything. Now, that's not a big deal on the iPhone, but it's pretty sucky on the iPad. I'm hoping this is just an early beta bug that will be addressed in the future, and this isn't how it's intended to ship, but they didn't really indicate one way or the other on stage. So here's hoping. App clips are going to be a thing. Maybe. Hopefully. You know, for example, when you go downtown and you find out that your city has some stupid parking app that you have to go to the App Store, download, create an account, and enter your billing details, yada, 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 just to pay $2 for 1 hour at a parking stall? Well, app clips are supposed to fix that annoyance. Tiny sub 10 megabyte apps will be able to be downloaded over LTE or Wi-Fi and appear as a basic little app card that lets you do basic little app things, like rent a scooter, order food, or pay for parking. They're engaged by tapping an NFC tag, touching a browser link, or triggering an in-app action. If these take off, I will be stoked, but I'm skeptical. A lot of app developers are pretty scummy. They want their app installed on as many devices as possible, and they want to collect your data and more. But hopefully this comes true because it sounds great. iAds, anyone? Oh, I almost forgot. The best part of iOS 14, you'll now be able to change the default email and browser apps. Finally! I can't imagine Apple is very proud of this feature since they didn't even mention it in the keynote. It was literally on the page of more features jammed at the bottom. It's probably just a move to combat the increasing number of antitrust cases being brought against them. But hey, look, I am happy it has been added, and I have long appreciated that about Android. iPadOS was up next, and man, I was kinda underwhelmed. After the Magic Keyboard release, I expected so much and came up feeling bad. You'll get the same iOS 14 features that the iPhone gets, except for there's no app library. Why? And widgets have to stay in the Today view. No dynamic home screen placement. Boo. Some apps like Photos and Files have added a sidebar, which makes the iPad feel a little bit more computery, requiring less clicks to do what you need to do. Oh, and then there's a new Spotlight search that can be activated universally. And while it doesn't seem much more powerful than its predecessor that's already built in, it does take more of a Spotlight look that I can dig. The biggest announcement for iPadOS was Scribble, which gave me major 90s Apple Newton vibes. Now you can write in text fields with the Apple Pencil, and it will auto-convert using OCR. You can also delete text by scratching it out. You can highlight text by circling it. You can hold inside of a text area to create room to handwrite, and you can draw vertical lines up and down to separate or join characters. I think this is great, and will give me, someone who's not artistic at all, more excuses to use Apple Pencil. Within Notes, OCR has been improved, and the app can now distinguish between text and drawings. You can also paste handwritten notes into apps like Pages, and it will auto-convert to standard text, which is pretty cool. Now there's shape recognition that can clean up your really bad circles. There is contextual recognition for stuff like emails, addresses, and phone numbers, which is pretty cool. And that's mostly it for iPad. Kind of a light year. AirPods surprisingly get a big update with iOS 14. All AirPods will seamlessly switch from device to device to device without needing to manually intervene. It sounds amazing, but I do question how well this will work if, say, your kid is playing with your tablet a few feet away. That said, I am expecting it to be pretty good because the U1 chip will be present in most, if not all, modern Apple devices, and their active device monitoring features are pretty cool. More impressively, AirPods Pro will be getting a huge update adding surround sound. Now, this isn't particularly new in principle. Phasing, anti-noise, and a bunch of other audio wizardry has long been used to convince your brain that two speakers are, well, more than two speakers. Apple said that there's support for 5.1, 7.1, and even Dolby Atmos surround sound certification, which is impressive. But Apple's implementation goes a bit further than what other headphones do. iOS 14 will use both the built-in accelerometers and gyroscopes in your AirPods Pro and your playback device. So if you're watching a movie on your iPad and you move your iPad, the location of the imaginary speakers will also change with your device's position. But if you move your head relative to the screen that you're watching on, these speakers will stay in place spatially. This sounds freaking nuts, and if it works as well as Apple has said in their keynote, it will not only be impressive, but kind of a game changer. If you'd like to see me do a review video similar to my AirPods Pro video once that feature becomes available, because it's not out right now, let me know in the comments below and I will be sure to deliver. watchOS got a few updates as well, like the long requested sleep tracking functionality. the ability to have developer-created watch faces, which is pretty cool, hand washing detection, which can become pretty useful in times like these. But look, I'm not really going to go into that because I'm not a huge Apple Watch guy. I'm not even going to try to dive into it because someone else that knows more than I will do a much better job at summarizing. And now, the finale, the part that got 50% of the keynote's attention. The biggest change to the Mac in 20 years! macOS 11 dubbed Big Sur! Goodbye, macOS 10. You've been so good to us. Well, except for Catalina. Boo Catalina on 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Come on. Boo with me. Boo! Say it like you mean it. Boo! Good job. Just kidding. You didn't boo. You don't get any praise. Yeah, no, Big Sur is a big deal for 2 reasons. For one, it's not macOS 10.16, rather macOS 11, bringing with it the biggest visual refresh to the Mac since Mavericks, released 7 years ago. But secondly, and far more importantly, it marks the end of the Intel Mac era, which began in 2005. There was a lot of ground to cover here, so pay attention. Let's talk design really quickly. I don't like it at all. Some parts are better than others, like the menu bar isn't too shabby, though I find it a bit too round. The addition of Control Center is a nice way to get rid of all of the old school menu bar items, and I think it's well laid out, similar to iOS, which is good. Notification Center was terrible on the Mac, and hey, it looks pretty much the same. But now it's transparent, so that's whatever. Now, where I have a problem is here and here. These new icons are abysmal. They look like a 99-cent Android icon pack designed by some 15-year-old. Take, for example, the App Store and the Books icon. They don't even look like they're from the same design team. Half the icons have this weird shadow 3D underglow, which gives me iOS 6 vibes, and half of them lack any depth whatsoever. They're all uniform in size, which makes me want to touch them with my finger, not a mouse cursor. And why? Like, what is this? Why? Now let's talk about the Finder app, which I have long believed to be one of macOS's greatest strengths. Functionally, it's pretty much the same from its predecessor, except the fact that they moved the arrow keys from their prior position, which unnecessarily breaks muscle memory. But what the heck? There's just no contrast. There's no text telling you what labels do. List views have weird padding on the left, but not on the right. It just seems too simple and yet too cluttered. The dock doesn't sit along the bottom of the display, but the windows sit along the top of the dock. There's no contrast between the menu bar and the wallpaper. System preferences look like Apple paid a guy on Dribbble $30 to make it in 2 days. Like, what is that? Look, I know that this is a beta and that refinement will come over the next few months, but this doesn't look like Apple design. This looks like something that Xiaomi would call MeMac. It looks like Apple tried to knock off their own OS. Ugh, but other than the design I don't like, which I know I'll get over and you may actually like, it's otherwise pretty familiar. Has the same hotkeys, shortcuts, apps, etc. All functions are to be as expected. It's macOS. macOS that looks like a half-baked Linux distro, but macOS nonetheless. They spent a lot of time talking about the new Safari, which has a few improvements like hover over tab previews, built-in translation, hello Chrome, App Store supported extensions, increased performance, and privacy report, which blocks trackers and gives you per-site security audits. Pretty cool, nothing that every ad blocker couldn't do for years now. More importantly to me, a new Messages app now copies the latest additions from iOS in what is now a Catalyst app on macOS, so there is actually feature parity between iOS and macOS. So happy to see that. There's also the new Maps app, which, wow, I don't care. And in general, design aside, which I realize is subjective, it seems like a really solid annual update. One thing that did stand out to me was how fast it was. It feels way faster than Catalina on my Mac Pro, and it's only in first beta, so it's only going to continue to get better and better over the coming weeks and months. That is exciting. Now we get to the big news, the moment we've all been waiting for, the moment that I have been prophesying would happen for nearly 5 years, and that is Apple's move to ARM Macs using in-house silicon and moving away from Intel, who's been their CPU partner since 2005. What does this mean? Well, the Mac in theory will share the same code base as iOS, which means that writing and optimizing apps for all OSs will be much easier. Apple has stated that their own Pro apps, including Logic Pro and Final Cut Pro, have been updated to support Apple's new ARM silicon, which means that in theory, these apps should be able to work on iPad Pro with little work in the future. We'll probably hear about that this fall. Of course, all of the benefits that have come from Apple's mobile silicon will also grace the Mac line. Insane power and thermal efficiency, no supply chain limitations, no waiting for Intel's cycle refreshes, and a lower cost to Apple, which in theory, although don't count on it, could mean a lower price to consumers. You have some questions, so let's talk about them. This time around, it is a Mac Mini with an A12Z processor. Yes, the very same found in the current generation iPad Pro, but this time with 16 gigs of RAM instead of 6, and 512 gigs of storage. These things are most certainly going to be NDA'd to high heaven, and they really are intended for developers, so don't expect to see videos on them from your favorite YouTubers. A lot of people are focused on the fact that it's an A12Z chip, but don't be, okay? The original Intel Developer Transition Kit shipped with a 3.6 GHz Pentium 4, a low-end CPU that never actually ended up in real consumer Macs. They were priced low, strictly intended for development, hand-assembled, and were required to be returned to Apple once the real, more powerful Intel Mac started shipping. This kit is no different. Apple surely has more powerful silicon ready to ship in future Macs, but they didn't want to play all their cards just yet, today, for developers. Hence the A12Z. The good thing is that you and I don't have to wait that long for the first ARM Mac, as they will be shipping to consumers later this year. Wow. The ARM transition is going to take time. Apple said 2 years for all new Mac sales to shift from Intel to ARM. I think this really means a couple of things. Number one, expect more Intel Macs over the next year or so. Apple is going to keep making them and keep releasing them until they're able to replace everything with their proper ARM variants. High-end models like iMac Pro and Mac Pro will likely be near the end of that 2-year window transition, as I expect making ARM silicon that powerful is no cakewalk. This also means that no, your Intel Mac is not worthless. Apple announced that future app binaries would support both Intel and ARM architectures until these products reach end of life. After Apple announced the shift to Intel in 2005, they continued providing OS updates to PowerPC customers for an additional 2 years. This time around, I wouldn't be surprised if it's even longer, which means if you go out today and buy a new Intel Mac, you're probably going to get at least 4 years of major OS updates. So don't freak out thinking that your existing Intel Macs are suddenly worthless. Of course, Apple has to make these new ARM Macs compelling, and while the new hardware will surely be excellent, there has to be software to run on them. And even with the developer transition kits, there's not going to be a lot of ARM apps ready to go on day one. Now, Apple announced at the keynote today that Microsoft, Adobe, and others were working on ARM editions of their popular apps. But in the meantime, it would be nice if ARM Macs could ideally run old software. And that they do, thanks to Rosetta 2. 2, you're thinking? Yes, Rosetta was originally released by Apple as a binary translator to help Intel Macs run PowerPC binaries during the last transition. Sure, this type of emulation, although it's not technically emulation, has an efficiency loss over running an application natively. But back in the Intel era, it really wasn't very long before non-native PowerPC binaries on an Intel machine were running even faster than on a native PowerPC Mac because of how much faster the Intel chips were than PowerPC. And I would expect a transition to ARM to be pretty similar. Apple demoed on stage today an A12Z. Remember, this is the same chip that's in an iPad Pro, running Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p with acceptable frame rates using Rosetta 2 in macOS Big Sur. Obviously, Apple isn't really expecting you to game on your new ARM Mac, but they've stated that Rosetta 2 will make it possible to run basically all of the apps that you run on your Mac now, without developers having to do anything, which gives ARM Macs a huge software catalog from day one. That's awesome. Even emulation of x86 platforms like Linux, Docker, and presumably, maybe even Windows, will be doable within macOS Big Sur on ARM. Surprisingly, even OpenGL, which is deprecated in macOS now and has been for years, will also be making its way to Big Sur ARM. Really odd, but great. This does have a few notable downsides, however. Boot Camp is most certainly dead. It's still available on my Big Sur Mac Pro, but that makes sense because it's an x86 Intel machine. Now, Windows for ARM does technically exist, but I wouldn't plan on Apple adding support anytime soon. It also speaks to the likely beginning of the end of the Hackintosh era. The day will come that you'll no longer be able to run the latest macOS on a Hackintosh, and that just so happens to be the same day that you'll no longer be able to run the latest macOS on an Intel Mac. They die together. That day is far into the future, but an order for the gravestone of the Hackintosh community has already been placed by Apple. On the other hand, however, the macOS Developer Transition Kit is literally an iPad inside of a Mac Mini box. So I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes possible in the coming years to run Apple's desktop OS on their touchscreen line of computers. Not really the same as a Hackintosh, but it does have the potential to be a fun future weekend project. For a few years there, I was really worried about the future of the Mac. I mean, in 2017, all of Apple's laptops had serious thermal throttling issues, there was no Pro desktop, Apple's own Pro apps were beginning to fall behind, and more. It was looking grim. But Apple has done a really good job over the last few years at bringing the spotlight back to the oldest product line that Apple sells, the Mac. And macOS 11 marks a brand new chapter and rebirth of the Apple computer, and I am really excited for it. I hope you'll get subscribed if you're not already, because I am going to be doing some of the most comprehensive Mac coverage, reviewing, and testing on YouTube in the coming months. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you didn't, well, that other button seems to work okay too, but most importantly, and as always, stay snazzy.